Hi everybody, Miss Curdy here, and today we're going to begin Lesson 5. And in Lesson 5, we are going to learn how to multiply by several different factors. And we're going to be focusing on multiplying by 0 and 1, and also by 2, 5, and 10. So we're going to be talking about 5 factors today: 0, 1, 2, 5, and 10. So before we get started, I just want to review lesson 4. This should say lesson 4, not topic 4. Please change that for me. Thank you. All right, so lesson 4, we learned about the meaning of multiplication. So if we take a look at this equation, I'm going to zoom in at this equation in the middle. 3 times 4 equals 12. Each of those numbers, which we call factors, the product and the symbols mean something. So let's start with this first number. This 3 is a factor that tells us how many groups we have. So in this equation, we're talking about 3 groups. And the 4 here is a factor that tells us how many are in each group. So we have 3 groups of 4. We know that the multiplication symbol, the X, means groups of. So we can read this as 3 groups of 4. And our multiplication means is or equals 12. And 12 is our product. It's our result. It tells us how many in all. So just to review again, we've got 3 as a factor that tells us how many groups we have. 4 is a factor that tells us what's in each group. That multiplication symbol, that X, means groups of, and the equal sign means is, or tells us how many. 12 is called our product, and it's what's in all. And we already talked about in lesson 4 how we know that a sum is the answer to an addition equation, difference is the answer to a subtraction equation, and now we know product is the answer to a multiplication equation. We learned that multiplication can be represented in different ways. We can have an addition equation. So we need 3 groups of 4. And we can solve that multiplication equation that, of course, is going to equal 12. We can use pictures where we've got 3 groups with 4 in each. And we can have an array where we have 3 rows of 4. All of those can show multiplication. They're all different ways to represent multiplication. And there's something else that I want to talk about is a very important property. A property just means like a rule that mathematicians have figured out. And it means it's the commutative property, which means we can switch the factors and still get the same product. So if I switched my factors around like this, and instead of having 3 groups of 4, I've got 4 groups of 3, I'm going to end up with the same exact amount. It just has a different meaning. Now we've got 4 groups with 3 in each. So same product, different meaning. And this is something that will come in handy for us in lesson 5. So remember the commutative property, I call it the old switcheroo. We can switch our factors and still get the same product. All right, so let's get into talking about lesson 5. We've got a couple of more properties or a couple more rules that are going to be very helpful for us in multiplication. So first off, let's talk about 0 as a factor. It's probably the easiest one to multiply by. So with 0 as a factor, we either have 0 groups or empty groups, and the answer is always going to be 0. So for example, if I have 0 groups of 8, it means I've got nothing. I have nothing. There's no groups. Who cares if there's 8 in them? There aren't any groups. If I've got 8 groups of 0, it means I've got all these groups, but they're all empty. So I still have nothing. So whenever we're multiplying by 0, our answer is always going to be 0. And that's another property. It's called the 0 property. It's pretty easy. When we're multiplying by 0, we use the 0 property. And any factor times 0 is 0. So here I've got 0 times 7. I've got a 0 as a factor, so my answer is going to be 0. 6 times 0, I've got a 0 as a factor. My answer is going to be 0. No matter how big that other factor gets, 0 groups of 700. If I've got no groups, I have nothing. 0 groups of 89, still nothing. We can do 1,000,000 times 0, still nothing. 0 times 1,000,000,000 is still going to be 0. So that's always everyone's favorite factor because it's super duper easy when we're multiplying. Our answer is always going to be 0. So let's take a moment now and move on to 1 as a factor. So we're always going to be thinking of one group, and the answer is always going to be the other factor. We call this the identity property, and it says that any factor times 1 is the other factor. So here I've got one group of 7. So if I just have one group and there's 7 in there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, my answer is just going to be 7. Here I've got 6 groups of 1. There's my 6 groups. And if there's just 1 in each, my answer is going to be 6. So whenever I have 1 as a factor, my answer is always going to be the other factor. My product will always be the other factor. Here I've got 1 as a factor, so my product will be the other factor. One group of 700 is 700. One group of 89 is 89. If I use that commutative property to switch them around and say I have 700 groups of 1, I'm not going to draw that picture because I'd have to draw 700 groups and put 1 in each. It's still going to be 700. So no matter where that 1 as a factor shows up, my answer is always going to be the other factor. So that concludes this video. So just to recap real quick, we reviewed lesson 4, the meaning of multiplication, which will be important throughout the rest of our multiplication lessons. And then today we learned about 0 as a factor, where we use the 0 property. Any factor times 0, the product will be 0. And then we also talked about 1 as a factor, about the identity property, that any factor times 1 is just going to be that other factor. All right, I will see you guys back here for the second video for lesson 5, where we talk about 2 and 5 as a factor, and we talk about 10 as a factor. Remember to fold your paper in half. I should have told you that in the beginning of the video. I apologize. And then cut it straight down the middle and glue this in your notebook so that at any point you can look back for this information. I'll see you back here for the next video. Have a good one. Bye, everybody.